supper. So last week, Kathy and I did an episode on putting all our food down for the winter. A number of methods, but certainly filling our root cellar. And I've been inundated with questions about, well, that's all grand, but how do you build one? So I thought today I'd talk about how we constructed ours, or other methods that would be as effective. I'm going to be breaking from an 18th century persona, but I thought I'd throw in a wee bit of history about the root cellar throughout the 18th and 19th century. So, since ancient time, man has tried to devise methods to preserve food. It was a survival thing. The first indication of kind of a root cellar type structure would have been the indigenous people of Australia. And it was slow to take on. It didn't actually start in England around, the late 16th century. So, but by the time we get to the New World, it becomes as common as one's house. By the time we get to the Canadas and the New England colonies, almost everyone had a root cellar. I was able to find a couple of documentations of ads that were selling houses. One was in 1769, and it was the New York Journal, a newspaper. And it said a house for sale, listed the house, and then it listed a root cellar that was 22 feet by 11. So a wee bit bigger than mine. Also, there was another one from 1771 in the New York Mercury, another newspaper. They were all over the place at the time. And it lists a farm on the Hudson River with over 300 trees and a well-built root cellar, stone to the top. So very common, and in fact so common that it wasn't a matter of it would be nice to have one. These were needed. If one was going to survive, particularly in the colonies, one had to have a way to preserve enough food to sustain yourself through the long winter. So I'm going to talk a bit about how I constructed it, and as I say, I wish I had footage. I don't, but essentially I dug into a side hill, kept the extra material aside, built a small log cabin. It's about 6 foot square, out of cedar, which should last at least my lifetime, and then covered it. Now I cheated. I've added some things that obviously weren't available in the 1700s, such as ABS plastic venting, insulation in the doors. So I'm going to go down, open the door, and try to show you how simple it is to build a long-term food storage for your family. I'm up here. I might as well start with the vents. And I'll show you inside, internally, what the two vents are doing. The reason we've got two, this vent here it stops just short of the ceiling on the inside. So it's going to take any hot air that is inside the cabin and expel it. Hot air is going to rise. This one is going to take cold air, and I'll show you inside, but it goes right to the floor. It traverses all the way to the front and stops about 6 inches short. And what that does inside, it's going to create a vortex, which is constantly exchanging the air. So let's have a look inside. So just before I take a peek inside, the first root cellar that Kathy and I built was in the first log cabin we built. And we didn't have an ideal site for a standalone outside root cellar, so we actually built one inside. We used a book called Root Cellaring. It's an excellent reference, whether it's a stand-up outside one, an interior one built into your house, one that's built on the level and covered and mounded with earth. It covers it all, the type of ventilation, what it does. So there's 4 functions that a root cellar has to have. Number 1, it has to never get below freezing, so it has to be well insulated. Ideally, it's cold enough that through most of the summer, it's cool enough to keep things like butter for a few days or perhaps a week, milk for a few days, cheeses for upwards of a month. Things like that can be used like a relatively warm refrigerator, but enough to keep food from rotting. Number 1 is the insulation. Number 2 is you have to have humidity. You need humidity from 90 to 95%. 95% is better. It's almost like when you step inside a root cellar, it should be like rain without it raining on you. That's how wet you want it. So a dirt floor is essential. The one we built in our first cabin, we left out a piece of the cement floor, which we just covered with gravel. And if the humidity gets too high, just like it can in this one, which has a dirt floor, we could dump 5 gallons of water in that gravel area and the humidity would shoot right back up. So it's a controllable thing. The next thing is ventilation. You need to be able to exchange the air. And certain fruits and vegetables give off ethylene gas, which will rot other crops that are stored together. So a good example of that is apples give off a lot. They'll rot potatoes, so we don't store the two together. The ventilation system will help remove some of those gases. And the last thing, it has to be dark, pitch dark, because direct sunlight will speed up the bacteria breakdown and hasten the rot of the food. So let's have a look inside. So like I said, not quite 1800s because they're 1700s. We have 6 inches of solid insulation, styrofoam insulation in the door. And you'll notice on the door frame, I've actually put a seal in, which if it gets worn or loose, I'll replace annually if I have to. And if you look down, you can see it's just got a dirt floor. So again, if the humidity gets too low, gets down around 80% or so, I just dump a gallon or 2 of water on that dirt floor and it'll shoot right back up to 95%. Obviously, you can see I've met the criteria of darkness. When that door's closed, it's blacker than the inside of a cat in there. So let's have a look at the vent system. Okay, in the back corner, you can see the cold air vent. So that's going to go all the way down to the bottom of the floor. So as it's come down to the floor, I've got a 90-degree elbow on it. It's going to travel all the way underneath this shelf, and it's going to stop about 6 inches short of that front wall. The second pipe, it's just basically cut into the roof, the ceiling right beside it. So it's going to take any warm air that's rising out of the room, and this cold air that's coming in, it sinks, comes into the front, and it creates that vortex that I talked about, which gives this crazy good exchange. Some other things in here that you might notice that aren't totally official for 1700s. I've used foam insulation. You can see it up in any of the corners. I also insulated this wall with pink styrofoam foam. Now, if one was trying to do this authentically, it still can be done. However, there's a few things you'd have to change. One would be a smaller door and thicker plank doors. So that's going to take care of cold air coming in or heat loss going out, and having more depth to the sides. So I've got approximately on the ceiling about 2 feet of soil. Now, if I didn't have that insulation, I'd probably need a minimum of 3 to actually make it work properly. And then in terms of storage, I had a number of questions. First of all, I had a question, and the guy says, what does that cog do? He wrote in a comment, and absolutely nothing. It seemed like a useful tool down the road. I didn't want to lose it, so I hung it there. And I got an old weather vane that kind of fell apart, but they serve no function in a root cellar. But I'll show you how we preserve the food in containers. Okay, so potatoes, cabbage, rutabaga, we just store them in the air. Now, obviously the wire basket isn't historically correct either, but they would have just made bins. The idea is don't have them too deep. Like, you don't want food piled really, really deep for storage. And I guess the key to success of these is about once a month is to inspect all the storage produce. That old saying on one rotten apple will destroy the whole bushel. Well, that's true in any root cellar. So if you find a rotten potato, you want to get it out. So you got to kind of go through them about once a month. So they're stored just like you see. Now I'm going to get a smaller basket that's lighter. I'll take parsnips. We store them in these half bushels, or in the bushel I could hardly lift up there. Not so environmentally friendly, they say. Peat moss is running out in the world. There are other mediums you can store this in. So sawdust, damp sand, not wet, but damp sand is another way. We found it was heavy. It was horrible to try to store through the season. But we found using peat moss really maintains the produce quite well. It's reusable, so we've been using this same peat moss now for 4 or 5 years. Well, since we built the structure. And that's essentially it. We've way more food than we're ever going to use. We gift it to friends, we gift it to family, we gift it to the food bank, and Kathy and I eat very well. Oh, the other thing, just on before I'll leave you, the storage, it's kind of key that they don't touch. So we put down a layer of peat moss, and then we'll carefully lay these out so each of the items isn't touching. Then a layer of peat moss, then another layer of produce. That way, if you do get some rot, or you get one that's already had bacteria start, and you didn't pick it up when you were storing them, might have cut it with a shovel or something, it's not going to wreck the whole bushel, and everything's going to be good. We've also got a very sophisticated inventory system. So we put a P goes for parsnips, C for carrots, and over here about 1,000 beets, and we put a B on it for beets. And we got that food all covered. We were successful a week ago, 2 weeks now, in getting a bull moose. The deer season starts a week today, and yeah, we are definitely going to eat well this winter. Almost forgot a few other items. So I mentioned don't pile the vegetables in big heaps because they'll lack air circulation. But a couple things about the harvest is only harvest when the temperatures are starting to cool down and the soil's dry. You don't want to hire it when it's mucky and wet because the vegetables are going to have a lot more moisture in them than you want. Don't harvest bruised or any fruit or vegetable that is starting to rot or decompose. So those are a few things. The other thing is never wash the vegetables. A lot of people, we get too caught up on hygiene and everything has to be washed and clean. You want that dirt attached to them. Potatoes, and I did not mention, it's called hardening off. If you just take the potatoes from the ground, put them in the root cellar, they're not going to keep that 3 to 6 months that we want. Because ideally what Kathy and I are looking for are not only to eat potatoes and eat well through the winter, we've both got some Irish blood in us, but is to have our own seed stock for the following season. So if we want them to last that 6 months, we have to harden them off. So we put them on newspaper inside. We make sure there's no light on them. We leave them for approximately 2 weeks. They're hardened off, then they go in the root cellar, and they keep very well. So there are a number of advantages to building one of these. Number one is food security. So we live in a world where it's very high energy cost for distribution of food, and now we're able to eat locally, and you also have that really good feeling that it's here, it's right in my backyard. I don't have to go to a store, and it's not a carrot that was shipped from California to Northern Ontario. So that's number one. Number two is it saves a lot of money. So even if you don't have large garden spaces and can't grow it, when produce is active and being sold in your area at farmers markets, etc., you can buy it bulk and you can store it here and eat it all winter long. And I think the last one, and for Kathy and I, a pretty important one, is there's a real connection to our food. We grew it, so from field to the dining room table, there's this real good feeling that this is something that we did, that is feeding and sustaining us, and so those are good things. And I'll just leave you with another thought. First of all, Kathy corrected me. This this here structure is 8 years old. But it doesn't have to be a structure like this. That book that I referred to will give you some examples of really simple ones that you can bury in a side hill. You can take an old deep freeze, get rid of the Freon unit, the refrigeration unit, bury it, put in some vent systems. You've got a door that opens up and down like this. You may have to insulate it. That's simple. You can actually leave it in the ground. You've got a natural root cellar if you leave your carrots and your parsnip and other crops. Now, some people like that. From Kathy's and my experience, I'm not going to recommend that because it was fine. But that one winter we decided you have to mulch over your carrot rows and your parsnip rows. And had it been a normal winter with soft, fluffy snow, perhaps, but we got ice storm after ice storm after ice storm. And when it came time to have victuals and I'd go out to try to fetch me some of those carrots, it was like I couldn't eat enough calories out of that to couple the amount of energy I spent trying to get them out of the ground. But in a normal winter situation, that can work. So as I say, it doesn't have to be this complex, and I encourage anybody to build a root cellar.